hear from our witnesses about FATCA's effect overseas and on our Treasury. However, our first witness, Senator Rand Paul, a friend, a patriot, truly someone who is willing to not only put his money where his mouth is, but someone who has defended liberty and freedom each and every day, and you're certainly welcome. He has a briefing, as I understand it, at the White House coming up, so we're happy to have you testify first, Senator, and then the ranking member, Conleys, and I will give our statement. So in recognition of that, I'd like to recognize the Honorable Senator Rand Paul.
Thank you, Chairman Meadows, and thank you for inviting me to this hearing on the unintended consequences of the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, and also for allowing the American people an opportunity to hear how FATCA undermines their privacy through the bulk collection of their foreign financial records. I oppose FATCA for two reasons. First, it violates our privacy rights, and second, I think the compliance costs actually exceed the revenue that it brings in. Regarding privacy, the Fourth Amendment prevents the government from seizing or searching a person's house or papers, including their financial records, unless the warrant shows individualized suspicion and probable cause. This protection was included in the Bill of Rights in response to general warrants that have been issued by the British. FATCA, I think, undermines the very heart of this privacy right. It forces foreign financial institutions to hand over U.S. citizens' personal financial records without a warrant, without a probable cause, and without naming them individually. FATCA also violates the Fourth Amendment by demanding that all data on all Americans with overseas accounts. The demand is not individualized, but collected rather in bulk, without specifying a specific suspicion or a cause. The government is using the heavy hand of the IRS to tell foreign financial institutions that they must hand over the records of all U.S. citizens, and if they dare to defy the government, they will be hit with a crippling tax penalty that no business could survive. This turns the Fourth Amendment on its head. It presumes that every American with money overseas is a criminal with no proof or even suspicion of criminal activity. You are guilty until proven innocent. These are not the principles on which our country was founded, and we should not stand for it. This is not just my concern. In January, the IRS's own taxpayer advocate raised the same concern in her annual report, saying that FATCA's operative assumption appears to be that all such taxpayers should be suspected of fraudulent activity unless proven otherwise. Think about that. Guilty until proven innocent. No one should be deceived that the data being collected by the IRS is somehow harmless or benign. In addition to having to report the name, address, taxpayer identification number of each account holder, the government requires financial firms to report the account number, the account balance, the value at the end of the reporting period, and all the inflows and outflows of the account. Basically, everyone for whom you've had a financial transaction or written a check to. Comparable information is not required to be disclosed for those who have domestic accounts. So it's a double standard. You have one standard for Americans living overseas and another standard for Americans here. The government has no business asking for or knowing this information about its citizens, and certainly not without a reason to believe that the person is doing something wrong. FATCA essentially gives the IRS all your overseas financial data without going through any court to decide if the government has a right to see your documents. FATCA seems to be also a solution in search of a problem. The taxpayer advocate finds also that a lack of comprehensive statistical data establishing the existence of widespread noncompliance or fraud by taxpayers with foreign accounts. They don't find evidence that there is excessive problems with people not paying their taxes. It's about the same rate as people domestically. So why would we be giving the government special powers, lower standard to look at our information? My biggest concern about FATCA is that it treats all 9 million Americans living abroad as guilty until proven innocent. FATCA acts as if the Bill of Rights does not apply to citizens dealing with their U.S. government, depending on where they live. After FATCA was passed, some foreign banks even began to refuse to do business with Americans, even canceling their accounts to avoid the red tape and possible draconian penalties. Individual Americans are not the only ones bearing the burden either. Estimates of initial costs of compliance reach into the tens of billions of dollars globally. Ongoing compliance just for U.S. companies costs more than $160 million a year. In addition, FATCA has led to foreign countries seeking information on citizens residing in the United States. Indeed, over 60 countries now have signed reciprocal intergovernmental agreements called IGAs. The IGAs allow bilateral exchange of financial data, meaning that the U.S. will now spy on foreigners who have accounts in our country as well, and we will aid and abet foreign countries in invading their citizens' privacy as well. Think about this. This may mean sending financial information to countries who are known as human rights abusers, such as Saudi Arabia, China, Tunisia. One can imagine the risk to a political dissident who comes to our country to escape tyranny, and then we find that we're going to be sending their information back to a tyrannical government, the tyrannical government they fled. These bilateral agreements, these IGAs, have not received any Senate certification, no vote in the House, no congressional authority at all. They are just done by the administration with no authority. Their constitutionality is currently being challenged in court, and I think you will hear from some of those involved in that challenge. My hope is that this hearing will shed some light on this abusive law and lead to a demand for action. Chairman Meadows and I have sponsored a bill to correct this injustice and repeal FATCA. Congress should pass our bill this year and put an end to this madness. Thank you very much for letting me testify.
Thank you, Senator, and you're very complimentary in terms of my involvement, but it's basically been your leadership, Senator, that not only has highlighted this, but that continues to stand as a vigilant sentinel to protect our Fourth Amendment privacy. And I just want to say thank you, and it's an honor to have you articulate this. You brought this issue to light when no one was paying attention, and yet I found that universally you're being applauded for your protection of those constitutional rights that our founding fathers so wisely enshrined.
This is a big, big deal to the 9 million Americans who live overseas. And, you know, we're getting ready to come up on tax reform. While this may be a small issue to many other Americans, it's a big deal to them. My hope is that the bill we've worked on, maybe we could try to get it into the tax reform package, because it's an issue I think that should bring right and left together, because, you know, sometimes the right is more concerned with financial affairs and the left more concerned with privacy and with civil liberties. But really, I think right and left could come together to say, you know what, we should protect everybody's Fourth Amendment rights. Thank you for allowing me to testify.
Thank you. I know you've got to go to the White House, so you're hereby dismissed. Thank you for your testimony. Your entire written testimony will be made part of the record. I thank the ranking member for allowing you to come in and testify early. The chair now recognizes himself for his opening statement. We're certainly pleased to hold this hearing to examine the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, also known as FATCA. FATCA requires foreign financial institutions to investigate their own accounts for suspected ties to the United States. Hear that again. Investigate their own accounts for suspected ties to the United States, and then report those accounts to the IRS for further investigation. Now, that doesn't sound crazy in its face, but as it turns out, FATCA is a failure at a number of different levels. By its drafters' own estimate, of whom we're going to hear expert testimony today, and certainly the work that has been done in some of those investigative modes is to be applauded. I've looked at the record, and so I look forward to seeing that. But even by those own estimates of the drafters, it was seeking to reduce tax evasion overseas, and it only does that by less than 1%. The senator mentioned this, so less than $1 billion out of an estimated $100 billion in lost revenue overseas. Commissioner Koskinen, who has testified before this committee a number of times, has given sworn testimony regarding the high rate of return on investment for spending on the IRS with normal enforcement activities. In fact, his public statements indicate a return of up to $20 for every $1 that is invested on enforcement. So a $20 return in revenue for $1 invested in enforcement. By contrast, FATCA brings in well under, by any estimations, half of that amount on a per dollar basis that is invested. So the IRS has asked for about $200 million to implement FATCA in FY 2017 budget. So by the commissioner's own estimates, not by mine, not by any think tank, by the commissioner's own estimates of enforcement returns, just shifting the money from FATCA to the general enforcement areas would increase our tax revenues by over $1 billion. And so if we're looking at proper allocation, and this is without spending one more penny on the overall budget for the IRS, it's just shifting it. And so when we look at that, that's a significant return. FATCA also unfairly and unilaterally burdens our biggest trading partners and strongest allies. I found out about this really by some of the people that we'll hear from today when I was in Israel, and with some of the issue that they started referring to this thing called FATCA that I had no idea what it was. And so, you know, as a good politician, I was saying, well, I'll get back to you on that. And so I went very quickly and Googled it to figure out exactly what we were talking about. And so as I look at this, we are looking at unbelievable implications here. When we look at the compliance costs on foreign banks and international, on the international economy, we're looking at up of $200 million per bank to comply, and potentially hundreds of billions of dollars overall. Other countries are understandably upset that we're hurting their economies and are doubly upset that we have not yet offered them access to our own taxpayer data. So we basically said, you have to comply, and there was this reciprocal agreement, and we've said, well, you have to comply, but we're not going to comply. It was a double standard that we see. And so many of the foreign financial institutions have tried to avoid these FATCA compliance costs by refusing to take U.S. citizens. That's what highlighted it for me. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. They're saying, well, if you're a U.S. citizen, they don't want to touch you in some of these foreign financial institutions just because of the compliance costs. So expatriates have had to make the tragic choice between keeping their citizenship and preserving their financial stability. And to illustrate that point, I want to share a video that has been shared with the subcommittee to this committee. And so if we'd pause and maybe take a look at this video. It's approximately 3 minutes in length.
I'm Donalane Nelson. I come from proud New England Yankee stock. In fact, my ancestors came over on the Blessing in 1635 to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. I've been a lifelong Democrat and an activist. I've often written Congress or called Congress members on issues I care about, and I have always voted. My career was working with credit unions, often helping middle class and lower class people with their finances. Because of FATCA, I am no longer a U.S. citizen. I had to choose between a normal financial life in Switzerland and my birth country. That decision was so painful that after I renounced, I vomited. It still hurts today. I've always paid my U.S. taxes, and in many ways, I was double taxed. I needed a specialized accountant to keep me in compliance, even though my income was low. It cost me about $1,200 a year to pay about $700 in taxes, which does show my income was limited. After FATCA was passed, my Swiss bank called me in. In the meeting, they told me if I did anything wrong, my account would be closed and I could not get another. The reason? I was American. About the same time, I began my first of 2 battles with breast cancer. It was a very difficult period. I started to research FATCA and its implications. At that point, many American expats were talking about being denied financial services, as well as having job problems because of FATCA. I realized if I wanted to continue living in Switzerland, I would have to renounce my U.S. citizenship. Once inside the embassy, a woman explained to me that I could never, ever get my passport back. I was shaking. Would I be able to visit my daughter and my beloved stepmother in the States? I was crying. I took the oath, separating me from my birth country. As I walked back toward the bakery, I threw up. On behalf of myself and millions of Americans living overseas, please, please, please repeal FATCA.
Donna is not alone. FATCA has led to a number of U.S. expatriates renouncing their citizenship. And so hopefully today we'll hear from some of our witnesses on how we can address this particular issue in a meaningful way and hopefully return the accountability that we're all for to the proper balance of protecting our personal Fourth Amendment rights and yet still making sure that we hold our government accountable. And with that, I'd like to recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having the hearing. And maybe there's a slightly different point of view about the issue while acknowledging there are problems with the Act and with its implementation. The United States taxes the foreign income of its citizens. And we're not alone. Most countries with income taxes do the same. Citizens pay taxes on all the income they earn, regardless of where they earned it. There are benefits to this system. Americans are the most productive in the world, and this system ensures that the wealthiest among us cannot avoid paying taxes simply by moving money abroad. It's quite simple. If you receive benefits by being an American, you should pay your fair share. And I say that, but no American ought to have to forswear his or her citizenship in trying to comply with the law. We obviously are very sympathetic to the woman we just saw on that video. This tax system assumes everyone plays by the rules and pays their taxes according to the law. We know, unfortunately, in the past, not everyone did play the game fairly. While the law has for decades required offshore account holders to file reports with the Treasury Department, not everyone did. Extremely wealthy tax cheats, not the woman we just saw on that video, hired expensive lawyers who knew how to evade the system. Whistleblower leaks changed things. Congress learned of thousands of Americans who were willfully avoiding paying their taxes on overseas income without disclosing that information to the IRS. These weren't simply inadvertent mistakes. They were willful efforts to avoid taxes. Congress chose to take some action. That action came in the form of this act, FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. Under that act, foreign financial institutions are required to disclose to the IRS the accounts of U.S. taxpayers. The Wall Street Journal reported that an IRS limited amnesty program pursuant to this act brought in $9.9 billion in taxes, interest, and penalties from 55,000 taxpayers who hadn't paid their taxes on income earned abroad. FATCA is an incremental step in terms of tax collection. U.S. companies and financial institutions already provide taxpayer information to the U.S. government through 1099 forms, and taxpayers with assets abroad file with the IRS the same information FATCA collects. Now, that information is also coming from foreign financial institutions, since many taxpayers previously had not been filing. Despite the new law, banks are still lending, and it is possible for Americans to get accounts. Citigroup, for example, operates in more than 160 countries and will give Americans abroad bank accounts and mortgages. Because of this act, international tax collection has changed. Countries around the world are adopting the Common Reporting Standard, which is based on FATCA. Under the Common Reporting Standard, countries collect identifying information from account holders. They then share that information with the foreign account holder's country of citizenship and receive information on the accounts of their own citizens. The information collected under the Common Reporting Standard is broader than that required by FATCA. Common Reporting Standard countries collect information on all account holders, not just U.S. citizens, with 100 such nations committing to implementing the standard by 2018. Efforts to evade taxes are expected to diminish. I certainly don't mean to suggest there haven't been problems with FATCA. We just saw one. Although it's important, the law does not require anyone to give up their citizenship. The advice came, as I understand it, from a Swiss bank. But nonetheless, we have a victim here. Nobody ever should feel they have to give up their U.S. citizenship. So there are kinks clearly to work out, and I think that's why this hearing can be very helpful. And we want to make sure that people like Ms. Nelson and Mr. Kutel are protected. Repealing FATCA, however, entirely would not restore their citizenship and could harm our government's ability to collect the taxes owed. We've had hearings in this committee about the fact that hundreds of billions of dollars, not overseas, but hundreds of billions of dollars are left on the table uncollected because the IRS doesn't have the staffing or resources or mechanisms, frankly, to collect taxes owed but not collected. And so, as we wrestle with the fairness of this act and its implementation problems, and certainly the injustice that individuals such as the one we just saw in that video have experienced, so we certainly want to address that. But we also want to make sure that the United States government is being fair to all of its citizens by making sure everybody pays their fair share. So I look forward to the hearing. I look forward to hearing the testimony from our witnesses. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for his thoughtful opening statement. We'll now go ahead and allow the witnesses, if you'll make your way forward, and I appreciate your flexibility with regards to allowing Senator Rand Paul to go first. So we would love to welcome, and we're going to keep these introductions brief. I understand we may have votes coming up here, 2:45 to 2:50 range, and so we're going to try to push a little bit quicker here, but I'll hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any member who would like to submit a written statement. So in recognizing our panel of witnesses, I'm pleased to welcome Mr. James Bott Jr., welcome, Mr. Mark Crawford, welcome, Mr. Daniel Kutel, welcome, and Ms. Elise Bean. Welcome to you all. Pursuant to committee rules, witnesses will be sworn in before they testify, so if you will please rise and raise your right. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. May be seated. Please let the record reflect that the witnesses all answered in the affirmative. In order to allow time for discussion, I'd ask that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes, but your entire written statement will be made part of the record, and so we'll now recognize you, Mr. Bott, for 5 minutes. You need to hit your little button right there.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Meadows, and thank you for the opportunity to testify. In my oral presentation, I will summarize the key points of my written testimony. Republicans overseas, for which I serve as Treasurer and General Counsel, advocates for the rights and interests of overseas Americans. As this hearing will demonstrate, our overseas Americans are the victims of a draconian system of tax laws that disrupts their lives, deprives them of a living, and strips them of their basic constitutional rights as U.S. citizens. At the heart of this is the fact that the United States is only one of 2 countries in the entire world that tax its citizens based upon their citizenship, not their residence. So the long arm of the IRS reaches out to the 9 million U.S. citizens overseas and taxes them. For the same reason that President Donald Trump has advocated for territorial taxation on corporations, U.S. citizens should also be taxed where they reside. The 2016 Republican National Platform calls for this. But it is worse than this. The Bank Secrecy Act resulted in the U.S. citizens being required to file a FBAR report, which applies to U.S. citizens and requires them to report to the IRS for any account which they have in a foreign bank or a foreign asset, and if the value is greater than $10,000. A willful violation of this law results in a 50% penalty on the highest value of that account. On top of this, in 2010, the Democrat Congress passed FATCA, which requires more reporting of personal and confidential financial information by individuals and by foreign financial institutions. Individuals are required to file a FATCA report annually if they have $50,000 in foreign accounts or foreign assets, whether they are in the United States, living in the United States, or living abroad. That report includes the name, account balance, maximum value of the account, and there's a $10,000 penalty. In addition, foreign financial institutions have one of three choices. One is to report to the IRS on every single U.S. citizen account holder the account information, the value, and then the gross receipts and gross withdrawals of that account. Or two, purge themselves of all U.S. account holders and certify that to the IRS. Or three, suffer a penalty of 30% of all transfers of all funds for all purposes from the United States to that bank. In addition, the Obama administration has negotiated illegal intergovernmental agreements which provide in most cases that the banks, instead of reporting to the IRS, report to the foreign government, require the foreign banks to report to the foreign government of information about U.S. Citizens, which is then reported by the government to the IRS. These agreements have not been approved and are unconstitutional. Thus, FATCA is a sweeping financial surveillance program of unprecedented scope that allows the IRS to peer into the financial affairs of any U.S. citizen with a foreign bank account. In so doing, FATCA has imposed enormous costs on individual Americans abroad. As this hearing will demonstrate, and as the Democrats abroad found out in a survey of Americans overseas, these surveys' results show the intense impact FATCA is having on overseas Americans. Their financial accounts are being closed. Their relationships with non-American spouses are under strain. Some Americans are being denied promotion or partnership in business because of FATCA reporting, and some are planning to contemplating renunciation of their own U.S. citizenship. A decade ago, about 200 a year renounced. Now the number is up to 6,000 last year. These Americans are in many ways ordinary middle-class Americans being affected in extraordinary ways. The FATCA has also imposed an enormous financial cost on foreign financial institutions, and through the IGAs, has converted foreign governments and foreign banks into IRS agents who are surveilling U.S. citizens and reporting to the IRS. FATCA has furthermore denied U.S. citizens basic constitutional rights, equal protection, due process, 14th Amendment protection against unlawful search and seizure, 8th Amendment protection against excessive fines. I am lead attorney in Crawford versus United States Department of Treasury that is making these claims. At the bottom line about all of this is that the Americans abroad are U.S. citizens who should enjoy the individual right and freedom to reside overseas if they choose without penalty. And America benefits when they do. They are ambassadors for America who promote this country and its values, and often are directly involved in promoting American business and products overseas. However, the U.S. government has placed a scarlet letter on the forehead of every American, and it is stamped USA. And as a result, they are treated as pariahs by foreign banks and employers. This is wrong, and it needs to stop.
Thank you, Mr. Bott. Mr. Crawford, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much for allowing me to be here today to share my firsthand experience regarding the consequences of FATCA from the perspective of an international businessman. My name is Mark Crawford. I'm an American citizen, and I do not hold any other citizenship, though at various times I've been a resident of the United Kingdom, Albania, Montenegro, and Greece. The politics that divide Americans at home don't often divide those of us abroad. Most of the 9 million Americans living overseas are ordinary citizens who are living their lives, raising families, studying, and working. We're just Americans, and though we're often far from home, America is still our home, and the U.S. Constitution is still our Constitution. In my written submission, I outline more detail about my personal background, having lived and worked across 3 continents over a 25-year period as a teacher in China, a missionary in Albania, a graduate student in England, a venture capitalist in the Balkans, a banker in Montenegro and Serbia, and now an entrepreneur involved in finance, natural resources, and film production. I've employed hundreds of people and increased economic activity between the United States and its friends around the world. Throughout my work abroad, I've remained active assisting U.S. interests whenever called upon, regardless of which party controlled the Congress or the White House, including having worked for appointees of the Clinton administration, supported USAID financial inclusion projects, voluntarily chairing American Chamber of Commerce affiliates, advising leaders of several American allied governments, and more recently, volunteering to assist the Treasury Department in Kosovo. Having worked in finance around the world, I returned to Albania in 2010 to pursue a business opportunity, and I ran into the consequences of FATCA. In smaller developing markets, there often isn't enough volume to support standalone financial products, so it's important for such markets to leverage off larger ones. Albania's domestic capital market is still developing, and in order to connect Albania to international capital markets, I founded an Albanian introductory brokerage firm that would work with Saxo Bank in Denmark, offering basic brokerage services to Albanian residents. When I sent the first 10 applications to Saxo Bank, they responded, approving only 9. I reached out to Saxo Bank to see who was rejected, and they responded to say that I was rejected. I own the company. I was told that though I was an Albanian resident at that time, I was rejected solely because I was an American citizen, because of fears, because of the FATCA law. I realized that due to FATCA, I could not serve U.S. persons in my Albanian brokerage firm because of the carry-on impact of the Saxo decision. The introductory brokerage vision that I had was alive, but the idea of working with Americans and American persons was dead. I'm the pro bono chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce in Albania, and I work closely with our U.S. Embassy there in a private sector capacity trying to promote American business. A brokerage firm owned by myself that markets itself as an American, led by the American Chamber chairman, that does not accept American citizens, is a logical anomaly to most in Albania, and understandably so. The introductory brokerage products became sidelined, and Saxo Bank eventually grew so unhappy with me that they dropped my firm altogether. The obstacle to my brokerage business created by FATCA was a deal breaker. Proposals to address the unintended consequences of FATCA have been considered by both parties and candidates on both sides of the aisle in the most recent presidential election. In recognizing the problems of FATCA, some have suggested implementing a safe harbor exception that would help Americans solely within the country of their residency. Such a safe harbor exception would not have solved the negative impact that FATCA had on my situation. I have never been a resident of Denmark. Thus, an exception would not have alleviated Saxo Bank's relationship with me or other potential clients that I was bringing through my introductory brokerage firm from Albania. In conclusion, my experience is that the American entrepreneurial mentality sets our culture apart. Americans do not restrict their investments based on their personal residency. Rather, they pursue opportunity according to the market. Access to international financial services is critical for all such projects, and FATCA's impact has already harmed some of my businesses, and if left unrepealed, will risk others. It is ironic that after spending much of my career helping advance U.S. interests by expanding financial inclusion through FATCA, the United States has inadvertently restricted inclusion for its own citizens. The fact that an increasing number of banks and financial institutions reject working with United States citizens outright harms our interests. It is my belief that the best way to improve the current situation is not to make the situation more complex by creating carve-outs or safe harbor exceptions or other partial fixes. Therefore, I do support a full repeal of FATCA, and I look forward to your comments and questions in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Crawford. Mr. Kutel, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to speak on the negative consequences of FATCA. I'm here, my name is Daniel Kutel. I live in Switzerland, and I'm here to tell you why FATCA forced me to renounce U.S. citizenship. As you see here, I brought my U.S. Army jacket. I served in the Army, I served in the Army Reserves, and then I got married in the Philippines, asked my wife to come join me in America, but that was during the dot-com crisis. I lost my job, couldn't find work. I sent my resume around the nation, but had no luck. So I took my chances in Europe. I did not leave the US to evade taxes. I paid my taxes. I enjoy paying taxes. I'm an economic refugee. I don't have a lot of money. I'm not wealthy. In Switzerland, we saved up to be able to finance a small condo. And then in 2012, I needed to investigate refinancing that condo. In Switzerland, every few years, you have to refinance. But when I went to a bank to ask them if they would allow me to refinance my mortgage, when they heard that I was a US citizen, they denied it. I went to another bank, I was denied again, and another. I called them, I was denied, rejected. It was horrible, terrible. I mean, if you've ever lived anything like this type of discrimination, it's unacceptable. I was worried that I would not be able to refinance my home, and so I called HUD, I called the VA, but they told me that they only help Americans who reside in America. They don't help expats. I called the Department of Justice to inquire why this law prohibiting national origin discrimination is not being applied. And they referred me to some statute that I could never find, which was supposed to state that also the law only applies to US residents. So I had to renounce, and it was a difficult decision to make. I went to a small village in Switzerland that I went to the first time that I came to Switzerland at the age of 10, where I was able to gather the strength to renounce. And afterwards, I was able to refinance my mortgage. But today, I'm here because I'm having a problem again because of FATCA, and that is with my children. My daughter is still a US citizen. My son, on the other hand, he's not a US citizen. So my son, he can have a bank account with any bank in Switzerland. My daughter, about 310 out of 320 banks reject her. And this is going to become a problem later on when she's 16. In Switzerland, it's a common practice to get an apprenticeship where she would go to work, earn money. She'll need a bank account. But having a bank account means she'd have to file FBAR. She'd have to be subject to FATCA. And, I mean, assuming that she even can get a bank account. And this is just a problem which rolls over. And she's going to have to relive what I relived, go through what I went through. She's going to have to decide if she wants to have US citizenship or if she wants to have a normal life in Switzerland with a normal bank account. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your testimony. Thank you for your service to our country, and you are in a minority. You're the only witness, I think, that I've ever heard who says they enjoy paying taxes. So, but Ms. Bean, you're recognized, and before I recognize you, I want to just say that this hearing, where it's highlighting some of the difficulties with FATCA, I want to recognize, as I did in my opening statement, the great work that you did with UBS and the investigation. And so nothing in this is meant to be disparaging of the consequences of what I believe are unintended consequences of really your fine work. And so I'll recognize you for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
Oh, could I just ask a unanimous consent request before we hear from Ms. Bean? I meant to do this in my opening statement. I have a statement from the FACT Coalition opposing H.R. 2054. I'd ask be entered in the record.
Without objection.
And I would also comment on the chairman's comment to Mr. Kutel. Actually, there are only two kinds of people who oppose taxes, men and women.
We'll now recognize Ms. Bean for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chairman Meadows, Ranking Member Connolly, and the members of the subcommittee for inviting me here today to present another view of FATCA. I was asked to testify because for many years I worked for Senator Carl Levin on the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and we held a number of hearings looking at how foreign banks were helping U.S. clients hide assets and evade U.S. taxes. To give you a couple of examples, we had a gentleman named John Mathewson who testified in front of us. He set up a bank in the Cayman Islands called Guardian Bank and Trust. Had about 2,000 clients, $150 million in assets, and he said, in his opinion, virtually all of his clients were engaged in tax evasion. He said his standard practice to handle them was he would set up a shell company in the Cayman Islands, open up an account in the name of the shell company, the client would supply the money, and then he would give the client a credit card in the name of the shell company, and he would advise them to sign it illegibly on the back. That way they could use the credit card in the United States to withdraw funds from their Cayman account without anybody linking their name to their shell company. We looked at two banks in Switzerland, UBS, the largest bank in Switzerland, and the second largest Credit Suisse. UBS, it was shown that they had 52,000 undeclared accounts, meaning accounts opened by U.S. clients that had never been disclosed to the IRS, with about $18 billion in assets. They were sending Swiss bankers to U.S. soil. It wasn't a case of us going there, but sending their Swiss bankers here to yachting races, art shows, tennis tournaments, quietly handing around their business card and trying to convince people to put their money abroad. They were very successful. They had tens of thousands of clients through those methods. They eventually pleaded guilty. They paid a fine of $780 million, and they eventually disclosed about 4,500 names to the U.S., but 4,500 is nowhere close to the 52,000 undeclared clients. Credit Suisse had, at their peak, about 22,000 undeclared accounts with about $10 billion in assets. They, too, pleaded guilty. They paid a fine of about $2.6 billion. But guess what? They never disclosed any of those 22,000 accounts to the U.S. The U.S. had to find those people on their own, and they haven't found very many of them. We did identify two clients. One told us about an occasion where his Credit Suisse banker met him at a luxury hotel here in the U.S. over breakfast, slipped him a Sports Illustrated magazine, and in between the pages was his bank statement so that he could know what was going on in his Swiss account. That's how they did business. Another gentleman told us about how he went to the bank's headquarters in Zurich. He was ushered into an elevator with no buttons. It was remotely controlled. He was taken up to a floor and shown to a room with all white walls. The whole point being how the bank was so secret, and they actually told him they did not file the forms that required disclosure of his account to the IRS. In short, our investigations, well, and by the way, we also looked at a bank in Liechtenstein, and there we were able to get very detailed records on about 150 U.S. clients who had accounts there. And we gave examples at our hearing. Just to give you one, a Florida contractor in the construction business set up 4 Liechtenstein foundations, opened up accounts in the name of those foundations, and stashed about $49 million in those accounts that had not been disclosed to the U.S. until a whistleblower turned over the documents to the agency. In short, our investigation showed that opening up offshore bank accounts for U.S. clients was big business, billions of dollars, tens of thousands of clients. Additional evidence of the scope of the problem is the IRS Offshore Voluntary Disclosure Program. The latest statement from the IRS says that they've now had word from 100,000 Americans, 100,000 Americans who have admitted to having an undeclared offshore account. And in order to get right with the government, they have now, as Mr. Connolly said earlier, paid a total of about $9.9 billion to get to satisfy the back taxes that they owed. That's the backdrop for FATCA. That's why FATCA was enacted on a bipartisan basis. The first thing to understand about FATCA is it does not impose a tax on anyone, here or abroad. It does not impose a tax. It is simply a transparency measure, and it matches what every American citizen has been doing for decades. All of us get 1099s that are turned in to the IRS about our domestic bank accounts. All of us do. It simply institutes the same program so that an American living here who opens up a U.S. bank account is treated the same way as an American living here or abroad opens up a foreign bank account. Recent research has shown that FATCA and other offshore account disclosure programs are working. Preliminary results from this 2017 study says that since 2009, the number of individuals reporting offshore accounts to the IRS has increased by 19%, and they have disclosed additional account assets of over $75 billion. It's starting to work. We're starting to change and end these offshore abuses. Now, how has FATCA helped? Well, first of all, it leveled the playing field between Americans who open accounts here and Americans who open accounts abroad. It treats them the same way. It also leveled the playing field between U.S. banks and foreign banks. U.S. banks no longer see their wealthiest, best clients leaving the U.S. bank and going to a foreign bank because they can open up a secret account. U.S. banks first. This restored a level playing field between U.S. banks and foreign banks. At the same time, everybody is correct that FATCA did not have a smooth implementation. It had a very rough beginning. There were a lot of banks that were furious at this U.S. attack on their secrecy and on their business model to open up these accounts, particularly in Switzerland. We went after UBS, Credit Suisse, and we've had a program to go after another 100 banks. Switzerland is very unhappy with the U.S., but you know what? Those banks have adapted. Those banks have said that they will comply with FATCA. And in fact, today, 7 years later, there are over 274,000 foreign financial institutions have signed up to FATCA and agreed to comply with it. In addition, that's 100 countries have adopted a similar FATCA program under the leadership of the OECD to do the exact same thing that we're doing. So disclosing foreign account information is becoming the global norm. So while it was a very rough beginning, people were very angry, particularly in Switzerland, that's not the case 7 years later, today. Now many banks have agreed to comply with FATCA. Now, we've heard today about how some American citizens are saying that FATCA is forcing them or leading them to give up their citizenship. But I have to also point out that that's affecting a very small number of people. In 2015, about 4,300 people gave up their citizenship. That same year, we got new citizens of 730,000, people willing to pay U.S. taxes. And when you compare that 4,300 figure to the 9 million Americans living abroad, you're talking about a rate of less than 0.1%. To conclude, I wanted to say that repealing FATCA today would be a mistake. It would hurt honest taxpayers who have to disclose their account information on a bulk basis every year to the IRS. That's what honest taxpayers do, and whether you're honest or not. That's how the banks treat your bank accounts here in the U.S. But it would hurt honest taxpayers here living in the United States to allow people who have the wherewithal to go abroad to not play by the same rules. It would encourage Americans to move more of their money offshore to get some of that secrecy. It would disadvantage U.S. banks, who would again have to compete against foreign bank secrecy. It would also waste all of the investments made by those foreign banks to comply with FATCA. They've all done it. They're complying. We began disclosures in 2015. All of that money would be wasted. And finally, it would return us to an era where it was much easier to have an offshore account, hide your assets, and evade your taxes. So that's why I think repealing FATCA would be a tragic mistake. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bean. The chair recognizes himself for a series of questions. So, Ms. Bean, let me go, because you made some very profound statements there that I'm not sure you want to carry them out. Are you suggesting that the whole reason to do this is that U.S. banks want us to do it?
Well, it's my understanding that when FATCA passed the first time around,
I'm just asking for your sworn testimony. Are you suggesting that U.S. banks are really supportive of this law?
Yes, I think banks do not want to compete against foreign banks that
So,
can't
so if I get the banking institutions to say that they don't have a problem with us repealing that, you would change your opinion?
Well, many of those banking institutions have foreign banks as members.
Oh, no,
So
I
they
know,
have
I know
split
that. That's what
opinions.
I'm saying. So at this point, if they change their position, would you change yours?
I think U.S. banks do not want to compete against foreign banks that can take their wealthiest
That's not the question I
clients for
asked.
secret accounts.
That's not what I said. If
that's
they
my
changed it, would you change your opinion?
If they, you mean if U.S. banks?
Yes.
Not their trade associations, which have foreign banks in them. But if you could get U.S. banks alone to say, we don't want FATCA anymore, they'd still have to comply, by the way, with all of the other.
Well, they're
Common
about to
reporting
have to comply. See, we haven't forced them to comply on this side, you know,
They do.
in a different way. We do not require them to comply with foreign entities at this particular point. So if France.
Yes, we do.
We're not forcing them to do that unless there's a reciprocal agreement. I've looked at it, Ms. Bean, and so we can argue the point. So let me go to one other side of this. So you're saying it's the investment that we made, even if it's bad policy, we shouldn't go the other direction because we made a substantial investment and everybody is getting used to it. Is that your testimony?
It is. Foreign banks, by the
All
way,
right.
these aren't U.S. banks, but these are foreign
Okay,
banks.
I got
that
5
are making
minutes, so
investments.
yes or no answers are the best for me, but you can explain, that's fine. So GAO did a study in 2013. And they suggested that really it's the voluntary disclosure that has most of this. It's not the IRS coming in. It's the voluntary disclosure that comes up with this. In fact, they said in that study, 80%, now these are the high-income people, so the lower-income people like Mr. Cutel would not be actually in this study, but they said 80% of the high-income individuals, the income that we recovered actually came from fees and penalties and fees, not actually income tax. Does that strike you as surprising? So of the $800 million that we actually got last year, 80% of that were fees and penalties, and it wasn't really taxes.
When people don't pay their taxes and they're caught by the IRS, they do impose
Listen,
penalties.
this isn't my first rodeo, I get that. What I'm saying, does that surprise you that 80% of the money we have coming in is actually fees and penalties? It's not tax avoidance, it's a penalty or a fee that goes with that. So the number we're collecting, the vast majority of it is just a fee and a penalty for voluntary disclosure. Does that surprise you?
It did not surprise me, but it also includes interest, I believe, not just penalties, but also interest.
Well, when we look at this, when we
I
look
think
at
is the biggest part of it.
it was 80%. I mean, I've got the study right here. I'll be glad to share it with you. It's 80% where basically comes from penalties and fees, quote. And so when we look at that, you know, then what you're doing is you're taking this number down, and so we're investing $200 million to try to go over, and we're assuming that they're not doing legal activity. I think most people actually agree with Mr. Cutel. They may not be happy about their paying taxes, but they agree that it is their civic duty to do so.
I would agree with you.
And so when we see that, we're making an assumption that activity is illegal, just like Senator Rand Paul was talking about. So what you're saying that it's okay for us to go in and get details on their private accounts and making sure that we understand that in case there is illegal activity. Is that your premise today?
I don't like getting a 1099 on my bank account. I'm an honest
That's not what I asked.
taxpayer.
Is it your
I
sworn
wouldn't get rid of the
testimony that it's
1099
okay for us to go look at the private individual account with the suspicion that there may be illegal activity, and that's okay?
I treat all Americans the same, 1099s or 1042s, I treat them all the
Ms. Bean,
same.
this isn't your first rodeo either. You're not answering my question. Is it your sworn testimony that it's okay to go into the private individual accounts under the suspicion that there may be illegal activity and look at that as FATCA does?
As FATCA and American law does, yes. I think
All right,
that is-
so let's look at it a little bit differently. So I am assuming you're a law-abiding citizen. Would it be okay under that same premise then for me to go look at all your emails and all your private correspondence, which some would argue is not as intimate as your financial details. Would it be okay for me to go in there looking for suspicious activity? Would you think that that would be appropriate?
No.
Okay, I agree with you.
And
so
difference is
what we've
one is about
done,
paying
but what we've
taxes,
done,
and the other one is about private communications. There's a difference there. All of us.
listen, my son is graduating from law school, especially his Fourth Amendment. So, I mean, we've had these arguments at the dinner table. And so when we look at that, I understand the difference. But as we start to see this, Ms. Bean, here's what I'm saying. We're investing money, which forces a compliance nature that is making people where they can't bank, or where actually being a U.S. citizen is a detriment internationally for any financial, whether you're in a single household or whether you're a financial corporation. Do you think that that was the intended purpose of this bill?
The Supreme Court and
Was that the intended purpose of the bill, yes or no?
Was the intended purpose to denigrate Americans? Absolutely not.
All right, thank you. I'll recognize the ranking member.
Thank you. I do want to, one wants to caution about only looking at extremes. So we can ask about, intrusion into Americans' financial information as if all of it's extreme. So I'll pose the opposite question to you, Ms. Bean. Would it be okay if we completely repeal FATCA and while we're at it, say that anybody is free as an American citizen to have a secret bank account in Switzerland and should never have to report on it and should never have to pay taxes on it unless they feel like it? What's wrong with that?
Well, what's wrong with that is we have tens of thousands of people who are cheating on their taxes and
Correct.
reporting honest
Right.
taxpayers.
FATCA didn't just come out of busybodies who love putting their nose in people's private business, and there was no problem to solve, and it was just another perverse liberal thing to do in Congress, right?
Correct.
I mean, there was actually a problem identified, which was rather substantial tax evasion in the billions of dollars. Hardworking Americans pay their fair taxes, and none of us like to see anyone cheating, right?
Correct.
Okay. Now, here's my question. Having said all of that, the testimony we've heard from your three colleagues at the table would suggest that sometimes, though, we've gone too far, that maybe the intention was good, but it's disrupted people's lives. We've had testimony from two Americans that they had to renounce their citizenship because a bank in Switzerland told them they had to, if I got the testimony right. And surely you would agree that's not an intended consequence of FATCA.
No, it is not.
So would you you said something about the rollout you admitted was rocky. So is the implementation still rocky? Are there still unintended consequences that maybe Congress needs to address? Or someone implementing needs to address?
FATCA still is far from a perfect law. There are things that could be improved.
Nothing's a perfect law. I hate that expression. I mean, that implies something could be perfect. Nothing is perfect. I wish there were, but there isn't. So we'll put that aside. It has problems in its implementation still.
Yes.
Okay. And listening to the testimony of the three gentlemen to your left, left? Right.
Right.
Right, sorry. Do they have a point? I mean, do you recognize what you're hearing here as a fair critique? Maybe not a comprehensive critique. Well, you and I would stipulate that. The purpose of FATCA is a good one. And it has done some good, clearly, in promoting an international standard and in collecting taxes that otherwise would have been foregone. But in doing that, either in the zeal or in the reach, it's hurt people unintentionally. That's really what we're hearing here. And I'm concerned about that as a member of Congress. I don't want to see fellow citizens hurt. I want to see tax cheats brought in. I want to see everybody pay their fair taxes, and maybe not everyone up here shares that philosophy. I do. But I don't want to be hurting people in the process who are innocent victims of, a well-intentioned piece of legislation that's overly broad or is badly implemented. And that's what I'm asking you to comment on.
I really think their concern is misplaced.
Whose?
The people to my right.
Okay.
I think what they're concerned about is they feel, in some cases, it's unfair to tax them because they don't live in the United States.
Can I just say, I've seen this, Mr. Chairman, if I can interrupt 1 second. I would ask everybody to forbear civility, and acceptance. This is not a hearing where you're shaking your head because you don't like what somebody says. We're going to hear everybody, and we're going to try to be fair, but you're not free to be, commenting through body language on whether you approve or disapprove of somebody's right to express themselves. If you're at the table, you get to express yourself. If you're not, please be forbearing and polite. Ms. Bean.
I was just going to point out that even if FATCA were completely repealed, you'd still have all of the same problems about people saying we're getting taxed when we shouldn't be, or getting taxed too much, or the process for announcing citizenship is too complicated or too expensive. All of those things would still be true because FATCA itself does not impose any tax, and it does not, of course, require anybody to renounce their citizenship. I think Switzerland was a particularly tough place to be, that the banks there were particularly upset because FATCA was aimed in part at Swiss bank secrecy. I think that a lot of those Swiss banks now have changed their practice. UBS and Credit Suisse now agree to open up accounts for American citizens and report them to the IRS. There are a lot of other Swiss banks.
Thank you. Unfortunately, both have been called. Mr. Chairman, just one. I would like, if it's all right, to have Mr. Bopp just comment on that, if you would like to. I'd like to hear the other point of view.
Yeah, very quickly,
Very
because
quickly.
we've
And
only
then
got a
we'll
couple
have
of
to-
minutes left,
yeah.
and we're going to need to recess and reconvene. So very quickly.
Thank you. I would just make a couple of points. First, this is not an unusual or rare problem that is affecting Americans overseas. The Democrats Abroad survey of Americans overseas found that 65% of married Americans overseas have lost bank accounts because of FATCA. Secondly, this does not level the playing field. U.S. banks have to file, 1099s regarding interest income. Under FATCA, foreign banks have to not only identify income, but also gains and losses, et cetera, also gross receipts, gross withdrawals, account information, value of it. No taxpayer in the United States reports that information to the IRS. And finally, regarding the penalty point that you made, the $9.7 billion that she's talking about of taxes, interest, and penalties, most of those penalties, we know anecdotally, were not because these people needed to pay any taxes and failed to do it, but because they failed to file this form, this one lousy form that generates a 50% penalty of the highest value in the account. If you do it the second year, fail to file your form, you're now at 100%. That's the penalty. And that is something that this committee should force the IRS to explain to the American people about how FATCA is working.
All right, we're going to reconvene probably for planning purposes no sooner than 3:35, so you can go get coffee, do whatever you want, and so this committee stands in recess.